In Westfield, Vermont, 75-year-old veteran Henry Granger drives his weathered truck, Old Gracie, delivering apples to the church. One crisp morning, arrogant businessman Brandon Turlo crashes his Maserati into Gracie. Unfazed, Henry pulls out an old flip phone and dials a number from decades past. 15 minutes later, 6 black SUVs roll into town, carrying men who move with silent purpose. They're not police, they're men Henry saved in a war long ago. As Brandon stands confused, the mystery of Gracie and a 40-year-old promise begins to unravel, hinting at a past far deeper than anyone imagined. Thank you for joining Henry and Gracie's story. Share your thoughts, like if it moved you, and subscribe for more heartfelt tales of honor and memory. Your support keeps these stories alive. Tell us about a keepsake you cherish or a promise you've kept. See you next time. Henry Granger's face was a canvas of lines, each one carved by the unrelenting hands of time, war, and a life spent toiling under the vast Vermont sky. At 75, his movements carried a deliberate weight, as if every step was a quiet rebellion against the years that tried to slow him. Yet there was a strength in him, not loud or showy, but steady, like the roots of the ancient oaks that lined the roads of Westfield. In this small town, nestled in the soft embrace of golden hills and sleepy back roads, Henry was more than a man. He was a legend whispered in the rustle of leaves, known to all without needing to announce himself. His presence was as much a part of the place as the chapel's white steeple, glowing gold in the dawn. Each morning as the first light spilled over the hills, Henry would climb into his 1970s Ford F-100, a truck he called Old Gracie. Her rusted frame groaned under his weight, her dents and faded paint telling a story of decades endured. To the untrained eye, she was nothing special, just an old relic, creaking and coughing like a smoker waking from a long nap. But to Henry, Old Gracie was a sanctuary of memory, a living piece of his past that carried him through the present. The cracked dashboard held a faded photograph of Martha, his wife of 41 years, her eyes alive with a laughter that still warmed the edges of his soul. Cancer had taken her, leaving a void that no amount of time could fill, but her presence lingered in the passenger seat, its worn cushions shaped to her form, as if the truck itself clung to the rhythm of her voice, singing along to Willie Nelson on those long drives through the Green Mountains. Beneath that seat, hidden from the world, was a folded American flag, its fabric stiff with age, a silent vow from a war-torn promise made in the blistering heat of Korea. Henry never spoke of it, but its weight was always there, heavy in his silence. That morning, Henry was on his usual route, delivering apples from his orchard to the church. The truck bed rattled with crates, each one brimming with Macintosh apples. Some a deep wine red, others flecked with green, like the freckles of a child's face. Their scent filled the room, blending with the familiar musk of old leather and motor oil, a fragrance as comforting to Henry as the air he breathed. The road wound lazily through Westfield, past fields where scarecrows stood watch and barns sagged with the quiet dignity of age. Henry found peace in the simplicity of it all, in the way the world here didn't demand more than it needed. He drove with the windows down, letting the crisp autumn air carry the memories of countless deliveries just like this one. At the white steeple chapel where the bell tower caught the morning sun, a group of church ladies waited, their shawls wrapped tightly against the chill. Their laughter was soft, a melody of shared secrets and small-town kinship, and when Henry stepped out, they greeted him with smiles that held years of knowing. "Brought the best of the orchard," he said, his voice a low rumble as he hoisted a crate with the ease of a man half his age. Sister Lorraine, who had seen him through the darkest days of his return from war, placed a gentle hand on his arm. "You're delivering more than apples, Henry," she said, her eyes warm with understanding. He nodded, his gaze drifting to the ground, uncomfortable with the weight of her words. Compliments always felt like a spotlight he didn't deserve. As he returned to Old Gracie, her familiar creak a small comfort. A commotion by the roadside caught his ear. 2 boys, barely 10 or 11, knelt over a broken bicycle, its wheel warped and its chain dangling like a defeated snake. Without a word, Henry pulled the truck to the curb and knelt beside them, his knees cracking, but his hands steady. "Looks like she threw her chain," he said, his fingers moving over the gears with a tenderness born of years spent mending broken things, trucks, hearts. promises. The boys watched, their eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and reverence, and Henry felt a pang in his chest, a fleeting echo of the child he and Martha had never had. In minutes, the chain was back in place, the wheels straightened enough to roll. The boys stammered their thanks, but Henry just waved it off, his heart quietly warmed by their shy gratitude as he climbed back into the truck. But not everyone saw Henry the way the town did. Brandon, a young man with a smirk that carried the arrogance of youth, leaned against a lamppost, watching the scene with a sneer. "It's just an old truck, old man," he called out, his voice sharp and careless, as if old Gracie's scars and rust were proof of her insignificance. The words cut through the morning air, but Henry didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice or meet Brandon's gaze with anger. Instead, he reached into his jacket, his movements slow and deliberate, and pulled out an ancient phone, its buttons worn smooth, its screen cracked like a spider web. His fingers moved across it with a quiet certainty, as if they'd been waiting for this moment, as if the phone itself had been holding its breath. 15 minutes later, the town fell silent. 6 black SUVs rolled into Westfield, their engines hushed, no sirens or lights to announce their presence. When their doors opened, the air seemed to thicken, the street holding its breath. The men who stepped out didn't carry the flash of wealth or the weight of authority. What they brought was something deeper, something heavier, a debt, a promise, a memory that no price could touch. Henry stood by old Gracie, his weathered face unreadable, but his eyes held a flicker of something profound, something unshakable. To Brandon, the truck was nothing but rust and ruin. But to Henry, old Gracie was a witness to a life lived with purpose, a keeper of vows that spanned decades, and a reminder that some debts, some promises, were worth more than the world could ever measure. The morning air bit at Henry Granger's knuckles as he wiped the last of the grease from his hands onto a frayed rag, its edges worn thin from years of use. He stood back, watching the boy pedal furiously up the quiet road, his laughter ringing out like a bell in the crisp autumn dawn. The kid's joy was infectious, a fleeting spark that warmed Henry despite the ache in his back from hours bent over the bike's rusted chain. He felt a quiet pride, not the loud kind that demanded attention, but the kind that settled deep in the chest, heavy and true. Fixing things, small things, like a wobbly wheel or a squeaking chain, mattered more than most folks realized. It was the glue that held life together, the unnoticed stitches in a world that always seemed ready to unravel. Henry turned to his truck, old Gracie, parked faithfully in the church lot. He rested a calloused hand on her door, feeling the familiar dents and scratches under his palm, like greeting a friend who'd seen him through decades of triumphs and sorrows. She wasn't much to look at, no gleam, no polish, just faded green paint chipped by time and weather. But Gracie carried his life in her bones, the memory of hauling his first harvest to market, the late-night drives with his wife's head resting on his shoulder, the quiet rides home after long days when the world felt too heavy. In this small town of Westfield, where life moved slow and steady, that was enough, more than enough. Somewhere deep inside, a memory stirred, sharp and unbidden. A promise made years ago, under a sky choked with dust and the distant crack of gunfire. A vow spoken in haste, in a place far from this quiet town, where survival was never certain. It wasn't time to call on that promise yet, but it lingered in Henry's heart, heavy as a stone, never forgotten. The air that morning carried the edge of change, crisp and brittle, with a chill that whispered autumn's impatience. Henry didn't mind. The cold brought clarity, sharpening the world's edges. He climbed into Gracie, the door creaking in protest, and started her up with a familiar rumble. The road down from the church stretched out like an old friend, every crack and curve etched into his memory. In the truck bed, a crate of apples jostled softly, enough for Mrs. Coig on Maple Street and a few other deliveries before lunch. Routine, predictable, the kind of rhythm that suited Henry just fine. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. At the bend near Dunlin Ridge, where a row of ancient maples stood like a curtain drawn across the road, the morning stillness shattered. It started with a sound, too smooth, too polished, nothing like the honest rumble of farm trucks or the clatter of tractors. It was a hum, sleek and predatory, bred for speed, not service. Then came the flash. A silver Maserati sliced through the mist like a blade, its tires spitting wet leaves into the air. It took the curve too fast, too reckless, hugging the road's edge with a carelessness that made Henry's stomach tighten. Behind the wheel was a man, mid-30s, one hand lazily gripping the leather steering wheel, the other clutching a phone. His eyes flicked up, catching Henry's truck, not with concern, but with a fleeting irritation, as if Henry were a pebble in his shoe. Henry's hands tightened on Gracie's wheel, his knuckles whitening as he jerked right, trying to give the Maserati space. But the road was narrow, hemmed in by gravel and trees, and Gracie groaned, her tires skidding against the loose earth. There was no room, no give. The impact came not with a cinematic crash, but with a sickening thud, a blunt, bone-deep crunch of metal, the snap of glass, the hiss of something vital breaking. Gracie rocked, shuddered, and came to a lopsided halt, leaning heavily to one side. In the bed, apples spilled forward, bright red orbs tumbling across the road like a child's marbles, scattered on a kitchen floor, some bruised, some split, their juice staining the gravel. Henry sat still, his hands locked on the wheel, his breath slow and deliberate. A sharp sting bloomed on his forehead, where a shard of glass had kissed him, warm blood trickling down his temple. He reached forward, almost instinctively, and turned off the engine. Gracie fell silent, and for a moment the world did too. Then came a click. Soft, expensive, impatient. A car door opening, as if it had better places to be. Brandon Turlo stepped out, brushing non-existent dust from his tailored coat. He was handsome in a way that didn't require effort. Sharp jaw, polished features, the kind of face that belonged on billboards, not back roads. His shoes, gleaming leather that probably cost more than most Westfield folks earned in a week, crunched on the gravel as he surveyed the scene. His Maserati bore only a faint scuff on the fender, a minor blemish he barely noticed. His gaze slid to Henry's truck, crumpled door, bent frame, apples bleeding across the road, and his lips twitched, not quite a smirk, but close. "You all right, old man?" he called, his tone casual, like he was checking the weather. "Didn't see you there. These roads are too damn narrow." Henry opened Gracie's door slowly, the hinges groaning as if they shared his pain. He stepped out, steady but silent, his eyes not on Brandon but on the truck. His truck, his Gracie, the one constant in a life of variables, now wounded, her frame twisted like a body after a fall. His chest tightened, not with anger but with something deeper, a quiet grief for the thing that had carried him so far, for so long. Brandon strolled forward, hands in his pockets, his posture loose, unbothered. "This thing still runs?" he asked, tapping Gracie's hood with two fingers, as if testing a piece of furniture. Henry said nothing, his silence heavy, his gaze still fixed on the truck. Brandon chuckled, a sound that grated like sandpaper. "You know, I collect vintage vehicles. I could have this cleaned up, put in a private showroom. Tell you what, I'll give you 10 times what it's worth. Throw in a brand new Silverado if you want." Henry's eyes finally lifted, meeting Brandon's. There was no warmth there, no malice either, just a quiet, unyielding weight, like the earth itself. In that moment, Henry wasn't just an old man standing by a wrecked truck. He was every mile he'd driven, every promise he'd kept, every small fix that had mattered. And Brandon, with his polished shoes and careless words, didn't understand any of it. Not yet. Henry's gaze locked onto Brandon's, his weathered eyes unyielding, carrying the weight of decades etched into every line on his face. "She's not for sale," he said, his voice low and firm, like the deep roots of an oak refusing to budge. The words weren't loud, but they landed with a quiet force, unshakable, as if the very earth beneath him agreed. Brandon, younger, sharper, with the polished arrogance of a man who'd never known a door that wouldn't open for him, and arched a single eyebrow. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Everything's for sale," he countered, his tone dripping with the confidence of someone who believed money could bend the world to his will. Henry didn't flinch. His expression remained steady, a stone wall against Brandon's flippant challenge. To Henry, the truck, old Gracie, wasn't just metal and rust. She was a repository of memories, each dent a story, each scratch a chapter of a life hard-lived. The thought of selling her wasn't just absurd, it was a betrayal of everything he'd carried through the years. He didn't bother explaining this to Brandon. Some things were too sacred to be bartered over with a stranger who saw the world as a ledger. Brandon let out a soft whistle, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel as he circled the truck, his eyes appraising it like a predator sizing up prey. He crouched beside the dented fender, running a manicured finger along the jagged edge. "She's got character, I'll give you that," he said, his voice laced with a condescending amusement. "But let's be real here, Henry. It's just an old truck. A relic. You could probably get a decent chunk for her, but she's not exactly a collector's item." The words stung, sharp and dismissive, hanging in the air like an insult to everything Henry held dear. Henry didn't rise to the bait. He didn't shout or argue. Instead, he reached into the worn leather jacket that hung loosely on his frame, his movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. From the inner pocket, he pulled out a flip phone, a battered, ancient thing, its edges smoothed from years of use, the screen spider-webbed with cracks. To Brandon, it looked like a joke, a relic from a bygone era, as out of place in this moment as a horse-drawn carriage. He let out a half laugh, his lips curling into a mocking grin. "What's that, your emergency hotline? Who are you calling, Grandpa? Ghostbusters?" Henry didn't answer. His face remained impassive, his eyes calm, but carrying a depth that Brandon couldn't begin to fathom. He flipped open the phone with a practiced flick of his thumb, the motion as natural as breathing. As he began to dial, his lips barely moved, but the words slipped out, so soft they were almost swallowed by the rustling wind. "It's time." The phrase was cryptic, heavy with meaning that Brandon couldn't grasp. Before Brandon could press further, Henry pressed the phone to his ear, his expression unreadable, as if he were reaching across decades to touch something long buried. The line didn't ring twice. A single click, then silence, followed by a voice, gruff, weathered, but unmistakable to Henry. It was a voice he hadn't heard in over 40 years, yet it stirred something deep in his chest, a tide of memories that threatened to pull him under. Granger, the name alone carried the weight of battles fought, promises kept, and losses too heavy to name. Henry closed his eyes, the years folding in on him like a slow, relentless wave. "It's me," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's time." There was a pause on the other end, a moment where the world seemed to hold its breath. Then the voice, older now but still steady, responded with a single word. "Where?" Henry gave the name of the street, his voice calm but resolute. The line went dead. With a soft snap, Henry closed the phone and slipped it back into his pocket. The sound was final, like the closing of a book, the end of a chapter that had been left open too long. He didn't look at Brandon, didn't acknowledge the younger man's growing unease. Instead, he turned to Gracie, his hand finding the dented hood, his fingers tracing the sharp crease where the fender had buckled years ago. The touch was gentle, almost reverent, as if he were comforting an old friend. To Henry, Gracie wasn't just a truck. She was a witness to his life, a constant through the chaos of decades. Every mark on her was a testament to survival, to loyalty, to the things that mattered when everything else fell away. Brandon, meanwhile, stood a few paces off, his confidence fraying at the edges. The smirk he had worn moments ago faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion that spread across his face like a stain. He shoved his hands deeper into the pockets of his tailored coat, trying to reclaim the upper hand he thought he'd had. "So, what, you just made a call?" he said, his voice tinged with mockery but laced with unease. "You think you're going to scare me off with some buddies from the VFW? Come on, man." He laughed, but it was hollow, a sound that didn't quite reach his eyes. Henry didn't respond, his silence louder than any retort could have been. Brandon turned away, his gaze settling on his sleek Maserati parked a few yards off. He flicked an imaginary speck of dust off the side mirror, his mind already racing ahead to Boston, to lunch meetings and insurance claims. He was a man used to controlling the narrative, to bending situations to his will. But Westfield wasn't Boston, and the rules here were different, older, deeper, unwritten. The air grew heavier as the minutes dragged on, each one thick and slow, like molasses dripping from a jar. Brandon paced, his polished shoes kicking up small clouds of dust. Henry stood still, his hand still resting on Gracie's hood, his eyes fixed on some distant point, as if he could see what was coming long before it arrived. Then it began, not with the blare of sirens or the screech of tires, but with a sound that rolled in like thunder, low and deliberate, carrying the weight of inevitability. Brandon's head snapped up from his phone, his fingers freezing mid-scroll. At the far end of the street, a line of vehicles emerged from the haze, 6 black SUVs, their tinted windows gleaming like the eyes of a predator, their engines purring with restrained power. They moved in unison, a silent convoy that seemed to claim the road as their own. No decals, no government plates, just presence. Raw, unyielding, and impossible to ignore. Brandon straightened, a chill creeping up his spine despite the warmth of the day. "What the hell?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. The SUVs came to a stop with perfect precision, their doors opening in a choreographed motion that spoke of discipline and purpose. Men stepped out, dressed in tailored black suits, their movements sharp and deliberate. No visible weapons, no insignia, but their posture screamed training. Military maybe, or something else entirely. Their silence was louder than any badge, heavier than any threat. From the lead vehicle, a tall man emerged, his silver hair catching the sunlight. He was built like a man who'd once carried 40 pounds of gear through hell and lived to tell about it. His face was lined, but his eyes were sharp, carrying the weight of experience and authority. He wore no uniform, but he didn't need one. His presence was enough. Henry's hand stilled on Gracie's hood, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what was coming. Brandon, oblivious to the gravity of the moment, stood frozen, his world unraveling as the street he'd thought he owned slipped out of his control. The air was thick with anticipation, the trees themselves seeming to hold their breath. The world was about to change, and Brandon Turlo, with his Maserati and his smug certainty, had no idea how badly. The air hung heavy with unspoken history as Henry stepped forward, his boots grinding softly against the gravel. His face, weathered by years of carrying burdens too heavy for most, bore lines that whispered of battles fought in silence. Each wrinkle was a testament to moments no one dared ask him to relive, yet his eyes held a quiet, unshakable resolve. Across from him stood Alan Ree, his gaze sharp as a blade, tempered by years of carrying memories that clung like ash. "Granger," Alan said, his voice low, steady, a single word heavy with recognition. "Been a long time. Too long." Henry's lips twitched, not a smile but a flicker of acknowledgement, a nod to a bond forged in the crucible of chaos and fire. "Far too long," he replied, extending his hand. Their clasp was not the warm grip of old friends reminiscing over coffee. It was the firm, deliberate hold of soldiers who'd once stood together in places where death lingered like a shadow. Their hands met briefly, but the weight of it, the memories of smoke, screams, and the relentless rattle of gunfire hung between them, as tangible as the morning fog that cloaked the world. Brandon Turlo stood a few paces back, his polished shoes glaringly out of place on the dusty ground, his sleek Maserati gleaming with an arrogance that felt hollow now. Confusion twisted his features, his usual confidence fraying like a rope under too much strain. His voice, when it finally pierced the tension, was sharp with uncertainty, trembling at the edges. "Wait, what is this? Who are you people?" The words spilled out, raw and unsteady, betraying the unease that clawed at his chest. Alan turned to him, his eyes locking onto Brandon's with a look so piercing it could strip a man bare. Instinctively, Brandon took half a step back, his bravado crumbling under the weight of that gaze. "We're the ones who remember," Alan said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade, precise and unyielding. "The ones who don't let debts go unpaid." There was no anger in his tone, only a quiet certainty, as if he were stating a truth as old as the earth itself. Brandon blinked, his mind scrambling to make sense of the scene unfolding before him. His eyes darted between Alan and Henry, searching their faces for answers he wasn't sure he was ready to hear. This is about that truck?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost hesitant, as if he sensed he was standing on hallowed ground. Alan's eyes narrowed, and for a moment the world seemed to shrink to just the three of them in the battered truck behind Henry, old Gracie, her frame scarred and bent but unyielding, like a warrior who'd survived too many battles to count. "That truck," Alan said, his voice steady but laced with something fierce, almost reverent. Pulled 12 men out of a kill zone in Kandahar. 12 men who'd be dead if not for the man who rebuilt her, bolt by bolt, with his own hands. The man who drove her straight into hell because no one else had the guts. Brandon's gaze shifted to Henry, really seeing him now. Not as the grizzled old man he'd dismissed earlier, but as something more, something heavier, like a monument to a war Brandon had only ever glimpsed in movies. His throat tightened, words faltering as he tried to speak. He started, but the sentence died, unfinished, swallowed by the weight of what he was beginning to understand. He's the reason I'm standing here, Alan cut in, his voice sharp enough to slice through Brandon's hesitation. The reason 12 families didn't have to bury their sons. The words landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the silence that followed. It wasn't just a statement, it was a reckoning, a truth that demanded to be felt, to be carried. Henry stood silent, his broad shoulders still, his eyes fixed on some distant point only he could see. He didn't need to speak. His presence was enough. The weight of his sacrifice, his courage, his quiet endurance, it all hung in the air, undeniable, pressing against the chests of everyone present. Behind him, the other men who'd arrived in the SUVs formed a loose semicircle around the old Gracie. They didn't touch her. They didn't need to. Their stillness was reverence, their silence a vow. To them, the truck wasn't just metal and rust. It was a relic, a testament to lives saved and promises kept. Brandon's voice came again, softer now, almost a whisper, as if he were afraid to disturb the sanctity of the moment. I didn't know. The admission was a surrender, his earlier arrogance stripped away by the truth he hadn't been prepared to face. His eyes dropped to the ground, unable to meet Alan's or Henry's gaze, as shame and awe wrestled within him. Alan gave a slow nod, his expression softening just enough to show he understood. Most people don't, he said. They forget, until something or someone reminds them. His words weren't cruel, but they carried a quiet challenge, urging Brandon to see beyond the surface, to feel the weight of what stood before him. Turning back to Henry, Alan's voice grew quieter, more intimate, as if the world had faded to just the two of them. You kept your promise, he said, his eyes searching Henry's face, tracing the lines of a man who'd carried more than his share of burdens. Now we keep ours. He glanced at the truck, taking in its scars, its bent frame, the memories welded into every dent and scratch. We'll take her. We'll make her whole again, but we'll leave the scars just like you asked. Henry's eyes softened, a flicker of something tender breaking through his stoic exterior. She's earned them, he said simply, his voice low and rough, like gravel underfoot. The words were a quiet tribute, not just to the truck, but to the men it had carried, the moments it had survived, the lives it had saved. With a reverence that bordered on ritual, the men began preparing old Gracie for transport. Their hands moved with steady care as if they were handling something sacred, a relic of a time that had shaped them all. To them, she wasn't just a vehicle. She was a monument, a living piece of their shared history. Brandon stepped back, the silence wrapping around him like a heavy coat he couldn't shake off. He had come here to buy something old, something he thought he could polish and parade. Instead, he'd stumbled into something priceless, something that shifted the very ground beneath his feet, leaving him forever changed. As the men secured the final bungee cord across Gracie's frame, Henry stood to the side, his hand resting on her bruised fender. His touch was gentle, almost paternal, like a father bidding farewell to a child heading into the unknown. His breath came slow and steady, but his eyes held no sorrow, only memory, deep and unyielding, a quiet strength that had carried him through wars and years and losses too great to name. Alan gave a sharp nod, and the men from the SUVs moved with a quiet efficiency that spoke of discipline, of purpose. They didn't chatter or pose for attention. These were not men doing a job. They were men honoring a debt, fulfilling a promise that had been sealed in blood and fire. Brandon remained frozen near his Maserati, his arms folded tightly across his chest, no longer in defiance but in something closer to awe. The cold air wasn't what made him shiver. It was the realization of how much he'd misunderstood, how much he'd failed to see until this moment. As old Gracie was lifted onto the trailer, the process was gentle, almost ceremonial, as if the men were carrying a wounded soldier from the battlefield. No one barked orders. They moved with a synchronicity that suggested they'd done this before, that this wasn't the first time they'd been called to honor a man the world had overlooked. The morning fog began to lift, and sunlight spilled across the road in pale golden waves, catching the edge of the American flag Henry now held. It was folded perfectly, tucked beneath his arm like a sacred relic, its colors vivid against the muted tones of the morning. Alan stepped beside Henry, his voice low but clear. "We'll take her to Fairview Restoration, just outside Malayer," he said. "They'll do the work carefully, exactly as you asked." Henry nodded, his silence speaking louder than words. His eyes lingered on Gracie, on the scars that told her story, the weight of her history etched into every dent. Alan's voice softened further, almost a whisper. "She'll drive again." Henry's gaze didn't waver. "She never stopped," he said, his voice steady, resolute, carrying the weight of a truth only he fully understood. The first rays of dawn barely broke through the haze over Westfield when Brandon stirred from his restless haze, his throat parched, voice scraping like gravel against the morning air. "Wait," he rasped, the word heavy with disbelief, eyes narrowing at the scene unfolding before him. "You're just going to take it? Restore it for free?" His tone carried the weight of skepticism, the kind born from years of seeing the world through a lens of transactions, where nothing came without a bottom. Alan paused, his broad shoulders turning slowly, deliberately, as if the question itself demanded a moment of reverence before he could respond. His face wasn't etched with anger, but something sharper, colder. A quiet storm of resolve that made the air feel thin. "Free?" he said, his voice low, steady, cutting through the morning chill. "That truck was paid for long ago. Not with money, but with blood, wished or saw it, and a courage that doesn't beg for recognition or headlines." His words hung there, unyielding, as if they could reshape the very ground they stood on. Brandon blinked, his mind stumbling over the weight of Alan's response. "But he's just a farmer," he said, his voice faltering, weaker now, like a man grasping at straws to make sense of something larger than himself. "A mechanic, maybe? I don't know. It's just an old, beat-up truck." The words felt hollow even as they left his lips, a feeble attempt to tether the moment to something he could understand. He stood there, hands shoved deep in his pockets, the confidence he'd worn like armor all his life beginning to crack under the scrutiny of Alan's gaze. Alan stepped closer, his boots scuffing the dirt, each movement deliberate as if he were carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken stories. His eyes, weathered by years of seeing too much, locked onto Brandon's. "That farmer," he said, his voice steady but laced with something raw, "is the reason 12 of my men are still breathing. October 18th, 2002. You weren't there. You couldn't know. But he was. He pieced that truck together with nothing but his hands and his will, drove it straight through a kill zone when our radios were dead, when the world was fire and chaos. Two at a time, he pulled us out, dragging us from the jaws of death while the desert burned around him." Alan's voice didn't waver, but his eyes gleamed with the weight of memory, each word a testament to a man who'd stood taller than the inferno itself. "You call him a mechanic? Fine. I call him the last man standing when every one of us had fallen." Brandon's mouth opened, but no words came. His breath caught, sharp and heavy, like a stone lodged in his chest. He wanted to speak, to argue, to reclaim the certainty he'd always clung to, but the truth in Alan's words pinned him to the earth. His world, so neatly ordered by profit and pragmatism, felt suddenly small, insignificant in the face of a story that carried the weight of lives saved and debts unpaid. Alan turned away, his attention shifting to Henry, who stood quietly by the truck, his weathered hands resting against its rusted frame. "We never forgot," Alan said, his voice softer now, almost tender. "Not one of us. It just took you calling to bring us back." Henry nodded, slow and deliberate, his eyes tracing the horizon as if seeing something beyond the dusty road. "I wasn't sure you'd remember the number," he said, his voice low, carrying the quiet strength of a man who'd never sought glory. "I never erased it," Alan replied, his words firm, unyielding. Not once, the men in black suits moved with quiet precision, securing the truck onto the trailer with a reverence that felt almost sacred. They didn't rush, didn't speak. When they finished, they didn't climb back into their SUVs as Brandon expected. Instead, they formed a line along the trailer, not in rigid military formation, but in a quiet, unspoken unity. A silent honor guard for a truck that had once been a lifeline, a battered old relic that had carried men through hell and back. One of them, a tall man with a beard streaked with gray, stepped forward. His eyes, lined with the weight of years, fixed on the truck, old Gracie, as Henry called her. He raised his hand in a slow, deliberate salute, not to Henry, but to the truck itself. It was a gesture that honored every dent, every scar, every moment she'd endured, every soul she'd carried through the fire. Brandon watched, his chest tight, his earlier certainty crumbling like dry earth underfoot. For the first time in years, he felt small, not because of his age or stature, but because of the gravity of what he was witnessing, the weight of meaning, of lives intertwined with this rusted machine pressed against him, leaving him raw, exposed. "I didn't know," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper, fragile against the quiet strength of the men around him. Alan glanced at him, his expression unreadable. "No," he said simply, brushing past. "But now you do." The convoy began to move, the trailer rolling forward with a slow, deliberate grace. Sunlight glinted off the chrome rims and sleek black panels of the SUVs, casting fleeting reflections across the dusty road. The town of Westfield watched in silence from windows, doorways, and sidewalks, their eyes wide, hats clutched in calloused hands. No one cheered, no one clapped. This wasn't a parade or a celebration. It was something deeper, a reckoning, a quiet tribute to a moment that had shaped lives in ways most would never fully grasp. Henry stood alone as the last vehicle passed, his flannel coat catching the breeze, the folded flag pressed against his chest, unmoving, a silent emblem of his own unspoken history. Brandon took a few hesitant steps toward him, his usual bravado on, replaced by a humility he hadn't known he possessed. He didn't offer money or a handshake. Those gestures felt too small, too trivial. Instead, he stood beside the older man, his eyes cast downward, as if the ground itself held answers he hadn't yet found. Henry didn't look at him. "You thought it was just a truck," he said, his voice soft but piercing, cutting through the stillness like a blade. Brandon nodded, his throat tight. "I did." Henry's gaze remained fixed on the horizon where the convoy had disappeared. "It's not." With that, he turned and walked away, his steps steady, unhurried, leaving Brandon alone in the dust. The younger man stood there, less polished now, stripped of the arrogance that had once defined him. For the first time, he felt real, raw, as if the weight of the moment had carved something new into his core. The town fell silent as the last SUV vanished over the ridge. The air grew heavy, charged with something unspoken, something sacred. Leaves skittered across the road in nervous spirals, and Brandon remained rooted to the spot, staring at the empty space where the truck had been. It wasn't just the absence of metal and rust that struck him. It was the weight of memory etched into every scratch, every worn patch of leather on the bench seat. He didn't storm off or slam his door as he might have before. He just stood there, shoulders squared but no longer rigid with certainty, the ground beneath him seeming to hum with the echoes of a story he had only just begun to understand. Henry didn't look back as he walked away. He didn't need to. Some lessons he knew were best learned in solitude, in the quiet spaces where truth settled like dust. 2 weeks later, old Gracie returned. In the hushed pre-dawn of a Tuesday morning, when the world was still cloaked in the soft gray of twilight, a truck rolled silently into Westfield and came to rest in front of Henry Granger's modest cabin. The frost on the ground shimmered faintly as the first rays of sunlight brushed against it, casting a silver glow over the scene. The men who delivered the truck moved with quiet efficiency, their faces shadowed, their purpose unspoken. They didn't knock on Henry's door or linger for gratitude. They simply left, leaving behind a note taped to the dashboard, its words stark and precise. "She's whole again, but her scars remain, just as you asked. Alan." Henry stood on his porch, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of black coffee, the warmth seeping into his calloused fingers. His breath fogged in the chilly air as he gazed at the truck. His truck, old Gracie. She stood there, not pristine, but restored with a kind of reverence. The dents, remnants of decades of hard miles, gleamed under a careful polish, unhidden and proud. The fender, once crumpled, had been straightened with meticulous care but not replaced, preserving its history. The cracked leather seat inside bore new stitching, reinforced yet unashamed of its wear. Henry stepped closer, the scent of fresh engine oil mingling with the crisp morning air, stirring something deep in his chest. A mixture of nostalgia and quiet pride. He opened the door and slid into the cab, his eyes falling to the small, faded photo tucked beneath the dashboard. His wife's face smiled back at him, frozen in time, her eyes bright with a love that had never dimmed. He sat there, letting the silence wrap around him like an old friend, heavy with memory. Then, with a steady hand, he turned the key. Old Gracie roared to life, her engine a low, steady rumble. Not loud, but resolute, the sound of something that had endured. Henry's heart thudded in time with it, a quiet acknowledgement of survival, of promises kept. He could feel the weight of the years in that sound, the miles they'd traveled together, the moments of joy and sorrow etched into her steel frame. She wasn't just a truck, she was a testament, a keeper of stories that no one else could fully understand. By noon, word had spread through Westfield like wildfire through dry grass. Neighbors drove by slowly, not to stare, but to offer quiet nods, gestures of respect, of understanding. They'd heard the story, pieced together from whispers and knowing glances. They knew what old Gracie meant to Henry, what she represented. Each nod was a silent agreement. This was more than a truck. It was a legacy, a vow honored in a world that too often forgot such things. And then there was Brandon. He didn't return right away, but when he did, it wasn't with the swagger Henry might have expected from the younger man. No sleek Maserati gleamed in the sunlight this time. Instead, Brandon pulled up in a dusty rental truck, its sides caked with the grime of long highways. He parked across the street from the diner where Henry took his Friday lunches, a small place with checkered tablecloths and coffee that tasted like home. Brandon waited, leaning against the truck, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. There were no sunglasses to hide behind, no phone to distract him, just a man standing awkwardly on a sidewalk, stripped of pretense. Henry stepped out of the diner, his boots scuffing against the gravel, and caught sight of Brandon. For a moment he paused, his eyes narrowing slightly, sizing up the younger man. Brandon stepped forward, his voice steady but laced with a vulnerability Henry hadn't expected. "I didn't come to offer you money," Brandon said quickly, before Henry could speak. "I came to thank you." Henry tilted his head, skepticism flickering across his weathered face. He'd seen plenty of folks make grand gestures, only to miss the point entirely. But Brandon pressed on, his words tumbling out as if he'd been rehearsing them for days. "I didn't get it before," he admitted, his eyes meeting Henry's. "I thought I did, but I was wrong. That truck, old Gracie, she's more than just history. She's a promise, a home, a record of every mile that ever mattered to you. Every dent, every scratch, it's all part of it." "I see that now." Henry stood still, his coffee mug still in hand, the warmth fading against his palm. He studied Brandon, searching for something, sincerity perhaps, or a hint of the arrogance he'd seen before, but there was none. Just a young man trying to make sense of something bigger than himself. "You see it now?" Henry asked at last, his voice low, almost a challenge. Brandon nodded, his expression earnest. "I do, and I see you too. Not just as the guy with the old truck, but as the man who kept a promise no one else would have known about if you hadn't made that call." Henry took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the words settle. He thought of the years, the quiet moments when he'd wondered if keeping that promise mattered to anyone but him. "Funny thing about promises," he said finally, his voice rough but steady. "They're quiet. They don't shout when you keep them, but they don't die when you break them either. They just linger." Brandon looked down at the cracked sidewalk, then back up at Henry. "I started something," he said, "a fund, quiet, anonymous, for restoring veterans' vehicles. Some of them don't even run anymore. Some are just rusting away in barns, forgotten. But they meant something once. They still do. Henry's eyes softened, just a fraction. He gave a slow nod, the kind that carried weight. That's a good start, he said simply. Brandon extended his hand, hesitant but hopeful. Henry looked at it for a moment, then reached out. His grip was firm, deliberate, a quiet acknowledgement of something shared. Not forgiveness, exactly, but understanding. That evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of gold and amber, Henry drove old Gracie down the back roads of Westfield. The cab smelled of engine oil and memory, with a faint trace of apples from the crates he'd hauled last fall. He passed the old church, its steeple stark against the fading light, and the field where kids played football until the darkness chased them home. He didn't drive far, just enough to feel the road beneath him, to hear Gracie's steady hum. It was enough. He pulled off to the side of the road, where the tall grass swayed in the evening breeze, and stepped out. Opening the glove compartment, he pulled out the flag, still folded with military precision, its edges worn but intact. He held it in his hands, his fingers tracing the fabric, and stood there for a long moment, watching the wind ripple through the field. The world felt still, but not empty. It felt full, alive with the weight of promises kept. "We kept our word, buddy," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustle of the grass. "She's still rolling." For a fleeting moment, the years seemed to collapse, and he could almost feel his old friend beside him, the laughter and the stories they'd shared in that very cab. The silence wasn't hollow, it was rich, woven with the threads of memory, of steel and scars and quiet vows. Westfield was no place for headlines. It was a town of old barns and honest work, where neighbors still waved as they passed your porch. No scandals, no red carpets, just the steady rhythm of life. But the most powerful stories didn't need to make the news. They lived in the creak of a truck's door, the knock of a neighbor, the weight of a folded flag. That fall, Henry Granger became more than the man with the apple crates. He became the man who kept a promise, not for glory, but because it was right. And in a world that often forgot such things, that was enough. In the small Vermont town of Westfield, where winter mornings draped the world in a soft hush of snow, Henry Granger became known as the keeper of memory. It wasn't a title he sought or even acknowledged, but the townsfolk noticed. They saw the way his old truck, Gracie, carried its dents and scratches like badges of honor, rolling down Main Street with a quiet dignity that spoke louder than any polished chrome. The truck didn't gleam under the sun, but it held a truth that resonated, a kind of steadfast presence that made people pause. Children, bundled in scarves and mittens, pointed as Gracie rumbled past, their small voices bright with curiosity. "Is that the truck?" they'd ask, tugging at their parents' sleeves. The parents, with a knowing glance, would nod, not because they'd read every detail of Henry's story, but because the fragments they'd heard carried the weight of truth. It wasn't a tale spun for entertainment. It was real, etched into the very steel of that old pickup. Henry felt the eyes on him, though he never invited them. In the quiet moments after Sunday service, when the pastor spoke of strength that moves unnoticed among us, carrying burdens we only glimpse in rare moments of grace, Henry knew who was meant. The pastor never said his name, but the congregation shifted in their pews, their thoughts drifting to the man who drove the truck with the faded paint and the engine that hummed like a heartbeat. Henry, however, shied from the spotlight. When folks approached him with gratitude in their eyes, their words stumbling over themselves to express what his actions meant, he'd just shake his head, his weathered hands brushing off their praise. "I just drove a truck," he'd mutter, his voice low, almost lost in the wind. But that wasn't what lingered in people's minds. They remembered the call that had come one fateful day, the one that set everything in motion. They pictured the convoy, 6 black SUVs lined up along Main Street like sentinels of a solemn promise, their silence louder than any siren. The shopkeepers, wiping down counters or restocking shelves, whispered about the flip phone, a relic from a time before touchscreens, that Henry had answered. On the other end was a voice that hadn't forgotten, a voice tied to a debt that could never be fully repaid. Brandon's return to Westfield was no grand spectacle, but it carried a weight that settled over the town like the first snow of the season. He didn't come with the flash of his old Maserati or the hollow apologies he'd already offered years before. He'd learned better than to think words or money could mend what had been broken. Instead, he arrived on a chilly Saturday morning, his breath visible in the crisp air, holding a small brass plaque. It was unassuming, its edges smooth, its words simple yet profound. He handed it to Henry without fanfare, and as the first snowflakes began to drift down, Henry read it in silence. The words were for Gracie, for every mile she'd traveled under the weight of duty, for every promise she'd helped keep. From those who lived because you did. Henry's throat tightened as he traced the letters with his thumb, his heart heavy with the kind of pride that doesn't boast. He said nothing, but his actions spoke. Stepping back to the truck, he opened the glove box, revealing a folded flag and a faded photo of his wife, her smile softened by time. With careful hands, he screwed the plaque into place on the inside of the glove box door, securing it where only he and Gracie would know it rested, a quiet testament to their shared journey. Brandon didn't linger. He climbed into a modest pickup, its tires crunching on the gravel, and drove out of Westfield. There was no shine to his departure, only a gravity that suggested he had finally found something worth carrying. Winter settled over Westfield like a familiar friend, blanketing rooftops in snow and slowing the rhythm of life to a gentle cadence. Children laughed as they dragged sleds through fresh powder, their voices echoing in the crisp air. Henry, now a fixture in the town's quiet heartbeat, spent his mornings on the porch, a steaming mug of coffee cradled in his hands. His eyes, lined with years of unspoken stories, followed the world with a calm that only comes from knowing you've done what was asked of you. Some days he drove Gracie into town, waving at the school bus as it trundled by, the children inside pressing their faces to the windows to catch a glimpse of the truck they'd heard about in hushed tones. Other days he stayed put, content to let the world move on without him. But every so often, when the sky was clear and the roads were empty, he'd take Gracie out on the back roads, just the two of them. The hum of her engine was a conversation, a reminder of the miles they'd traveled together, the weight they'd carried, and the promises they'd kept. In those moments, Henry's heart felt full, not with pride, but with peace, a peace that comes from knowing you've been true to something larger than yourself. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the snow in shades of gold and pink, a young boy from the church approached Henry's porch. His boots crunched on the path, and his voice was timid, barely rising above the winter quiet. "Mr. Granger," he said, clutching his hat in his hands, "is it true your truck was in a war?" Henry's chuckle was warm, like a fire crackling in the hearth. "She wasn't enlisted, son," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners, "but she's seen her share of battlefields." The boy's brow furrowed, his young mind wrestling with the idea. "Did she really save people?" he asked, his voice small but earnest. Henry paused, his gaze dropping to the folded flag resting in his lap, its edges worn, but its stars still bright. "She didn't save anyone," he said softly, his words deliberate. "She just got them to someone who could." The boy nodded, his face serious as he turned the thought over in his mind. "That's kind of the same thing, right?" he ventured. Henry's smile was slow, deep, the kind that carries a lifetime of understanding. "Maybe it is," he said, and the boy walked away, his steps a little lighter, his heart a little fuller. In time, Gracie's story wove itself into the fabric of Westfield, not with fanfare or monuments, but in the quiet way stories become legends. It wasn't told in parades or written in textbooks, but it lived in the way people looked at old things with new respect, in the way they began to see promises as sacred, not disposable. Even the youngest children, barely old enough to understand, learned that heroes don't always wear medals or drive sleek cars. Some just drive forward when no one else will, their resolve as steady as the rumble of an old engine. In that quiet Vermont town where snow fell like fragments of memory and morning light shimmered through frost-covered windows, Henry Granger lived out his days with a peace that settled deep in his chest. Gracie sat in his driveway, no longer just a truck, but a vessel for sacrifice, for promises kept, for a story that reminded everyone that value isn't measured by price tags or polish. In a world quick to discard what's worn, Henry and Gracie stood as proof that some things, some people, carry a worth that time can't diminish. and Westfield, with its snow-dusted streets and warm, glowing windows, remembered. In a world that races forward, where new gadgets replace the old in a heartbeat and value is often measured by price tags, there's something quietly profound about the things and people we overlook. It's easy to rush past the worn out, the faded, the seemingly insignificant, without pausing to consider the weight of their stories. Those stories, like an old truck parked at the edge of a field, rusted and weathered, hold memories that no shiny upgrade could ever replicate. They carry the kind of meaning that lingers in the heart, heavy with love, loss, and promises kept against all odds. Take Henry, for instance, a man whose presence might go unnoticed in a crowded room. He's the kind of person who moves through life with a quiet steadiness, his hands rough from years of hard work, his eyes carrying the glint of memories he rarely shares. To most, he's just another face, maybe the old man who sits alone at the back of the church every Sunday, his coat threadbare but neatly pressed. But to those who take the time to listen, Henry is a living archive of a life well lived. His heart holds promises he made long ago, to a wife who's now gone, to a family he raised through lean times, to a way of life that valued loyalty over convenience. Every crease in his face tells a story of sacrifice, of moments when he chose to hold on to what mattered, even when the world told him to let go. There's a deep ache in Henry's chest when he thinks of the point, a mix of pride and sorrow for the years that have slipped away. Yet there's also a quiet resolve, a determination to keep those promises alive, to carry them like a torch through the dusk of his life. Or consider the objects we pass by without a second glance. A grandfather's jacket hanging in the closet, its leather cracked, and its pockets still holding the faint scent of pipe tobacco. To anyone else, it's just an old coat, something to be donated or discarded. But to the person who loved him, it's a portal to the past. Running their fingers over the worn fabric, they can almost hear his laughter, feel the warmth of his hug on a cold winter morning. That jacket holds the weight of countless moments, walks through the snow, quiet evenings by the fire, words of wisdom shared over a cup of coffee. Throwing it away would feel like betraying those memories, like erasing a piece of the man who wore it. The person who keeps it close isn't clinging to clutter. They're guarding a treasure, one that no amount of money could replace. Their heart swells with love and grief each time they see it, a reminder of a bond that time can't break. Then there's the mother's recipe card, tucked away in a kitchen drawer, its edges yellowed and smudged with flour. To an outsider, it's just a piece of paper, easily replaced by a quick search online. But to the child who grew up watching her stir batter in a sunlit kitchen, it's sacred. Each handwritten word carries her voice, her patience, her love poured into every meal she made. The card isn't just instructions for a cake. It's a map to a time when life felt simpler, when a warm kitchen was a haven from the world. Holding it, they feel a pang of longing, a wish to hear her hum one more time, to ask her the questions they never thought to ask when she was here. Keeping that card isn't about sentimentality. It's about honoring a legacy, about carrying forward a piece of her spirit in every batch they bake. And what about the neighbor, the one who sits quietly at the edge of the church hall every Sunday? To most, she's just a background figure, someone whose name they might not even know. But if you stop to talk, you'd find a woman whose life is a tapestry of resilience and grace. Her hands tremble now, but they once held babies through sleepless nights, stitched clothes to make ends meet, and wrote letters to a soldier who never came home. She carries those memories in silence, not because she wants to, but because she's learned that the world often moves too fast to listen. There's a quiet dignity in her solitude, a strength forged through years of standing tall despite heartbreak. She wonders sometimes if anyone sees her, if her life story will fade away unnoticed. Yet she keeps showing up, her presence a testament to a promise she made to herself long ago, to keep going, to find meaning in the small moments, to believe that her life still matters. These people, these objects, they're all around us, like old trucks left to rust in the fields of our lives. They don't demand attention. They don't come with applause or flashing lights. But they carry a quiet power, a reminder that some things are worth holding on to, no matter how worn or outdated they seem. Promises, too, can be like that. Sacred vows made not for profit or praise, but for love, for duty, for the sake of something bigger than ourselves. Keeping those promises can be hard, especially in a world that values speed and disposability. But for those who do like Henry, like the keeper of the jacket or the recipe card, there's a deep satisfaction, a sense of standing firm in a storm. In the end, it's about seeing what others miss. It's about pausing to notice the beauty in the broken, the value in the overlooked. It's about listening to the stories of the quiet heroes among us before their voices fade. Because sometimes the things and people we walk past without seeing are the ones that hold the deepest truths. They remind us that love, memory, and promises kept are the threads that weave a life worth living. So take the long road home and keep your eyes open. You never know what story you might find waiting silently to be heard.